Cool. Thank you very much for everyone joining today. Hopefully we have less AI assistants than real people. And thank you for putting up with a 1.5-minute video on Cresco 20 years. Hopefully I look as young as I did 20 years ago. Unfortunately not, according to my children. But thank you very much for joining us today. A workshop focused or webinar focused on SAWEM. And we have the speakers below, who I think most of you already know, and they will introduce themselves separately. But the idea of today's workshop is really around gaining momentum on SAWEM. And Cresco did an event with Bowman's about in February time, and Keith was there. And I think we had over 300 or 400 people both attend in person and online. And if we'd done this event a year ago, we might just have had the speakers. So for us, there was a huge push forward into showing the awareness. And I think the purpose of today's webinar, once again, is really to continue to show the awareness and how SAWEM is moving ahead, creating momentum. Yes, we're trying to still figure things out in a certain way, and no one will ever be perfect. But the focus today is very much on a positive view on SAWEM. We're not going to go into details on vesting contracts and pricing and stuff. It's more at a macro level, what's happening, what are the considerations. James is going to touch on the NECOM approach or Energy Council approach. I'm going to talk about how the private sector is looking at this within the reference point of other things happening. Keith's going to tell us about the market and timings and when it's coming. And then Vincenzia from Standard Bank is going to talk about how does funding link into the market and how changes are there. And I'm conscious if we actually unpacked each of the topics that we're going to talk about in a lot more detail, we might be here for 2.5 or 3 hours, similar to Chris Yellen's webinars. But I think we are just trying to catch a snapshot of each of those to give each of the various attendees a view of what's happening. Once again, you don't have to take snapshots. The presentations will be shared. If you registered and you're online, you will get a full recording afterwards. So, and if there are questions, please put them in the chat. And we'll try and attend to as many questions that are applicable to the topic as possible. And we'll also try and reply to some of the questions we don't get to on the call or on the webinar afterwards in the post-match presentation and feedback. Over to you, James. Thank you very much.
I hope that I'm audible. Thank you very much, Rob, and good afternoon, colleagues and everyone on the call. Good, let's move on. And so keeping in line with the theme here today of let's focus on reality, I think I'm going to have and we don't have a lot of time, I've just got 3 slides, so I'm going to be very focused on the messaging. Really, the market introduction is central to all reforms. And so I think that we've got to move actually our language and our thinking from awareness to one of active preparation and participation. This will happen, and it's very important that it does happen. We can move to the next slide, thanks. Both the President and the Minister are on record publicly saying that our reform agenda is irreversible. We can move to the next slide, if that's all right, thanks. Good. So if we put this in context, potentially the takeaway, I think, from my sort of introduction is a bit of a call to action to industry. As I said, this is not about awareness. We now are in the final sort of run. The target still remains, and Keith will talk to that, April next year, and the work that's being done and the preparation by the public sector is ongoing through NECOM. The presidency had quite detailed engagements actually with the ministry on Tuesday. They are also actively starting to work on this, and so I think there's a very positive sense of momentum I see on the public sector side. A little bit in contrary, on the private sector side, a lot of the conversations that I do have are centered around, well, we're not sure this will happen. We don't think it'll happen. It will be delayed. And we know there's a little bit of a lack of trust. And I would like to put out the message. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. And we do have to now start really actively preparing ourselves, understanding how the market reforms and introduction will work, and specifically what must private sector do to prepare. So on the theme of the energy reform agenda being irreversible, why is the market important? Well, specifically from a technical perspective, with this sort of expanding and diversified and more digital system, the system operator needs the market for visibility. But we all, I think if you've seen in the papers today, the article about Eskom acting as the battery, there are also elements that the market does have important technical role in the sustainability of the transition going forward. The next important area, though, is financial sustainability, and Rob will talk to this. But we have moved through the National Treasury sort of balance sheet backing all of procurement. We've moved through the corporate balance sheets backing that. We now have to still move into the private sector backing it back through the market. And so this will require new financial products, services, thinking shifts in the sector. And so that's very important that we have time to prepare for that and focus on that. And then lastly, around why it's important is obviously efficiency, transparency, and price discovery. And this really is very pertinent when we look at the moment at some of the engagements around the IRP and the long-term planning. Really, and as the Energy Council, we are leading the IRP engagement at NEDLAC. And so very pertinent, we're sitting with these kind of quite difficult discussions, where historically the IRP was regarded as a central purchasing procurement tool. We're now moving into a dynamic environment of the market where the IRP should be a guide, and the Section 34 determinations and legislative authority of the minister is against the market readiness, well, not the market readiness, but the market effectiveness, and using Section 34s to intervene where there are potential market failures. So again, a lot of complexity and sort of changing environment, but it is happening. So if we move to the next slide, thank you. This is just a kind of quick view or outlook of how one could think about this and gain a little bit more maybe comfort that it is a manageable process and it's not just all in the market on day one. So the most sort of benign or easiest start to the market, if you look at phase one, really is just Eskom to Eskom. Technically, this is essentially already being done. And Mark, Keith will talk to the preparation of the market codes and other aspects within the public sector readiness, which I certainly believe actually are on track. One can then look at the private sector entry and then municipal entry. Now, different role players in private sector and municipal are going to have different levels of readiness and different sort of aspirations around entry. So this has to be thought of, but there are, again, many ways in which one can phase this and manage risk. So even from pilots, bringing in certain groupings, LPUs, generators, introduce balancing. And then really you leave the last part of the market development is then the sophistication, which is sort of the expansion, the deepening, and then aspects like green and renewable energy credits, so RECs. So, once we're starting to get the market established, there's data, we've brought a lot of the Eskom issues in front of the paywall, so to speak, then we can start looking at sort of intraday capacity reserve market. And so we've got time and we can manage this, and it will be a staged and a phased and a risk-adjusted implementation. It's not that all of this will have to happen on day one. And then we go to the last slide. So I think often what I do here is kind of pushback, potentially largely from actually the sort of LPUs and industrial players. I think the most bullish role players are more in the sort of trader and developer space who see a lot of opportunity and are keen to get into the market. But really, what we've got to think about now is specifically, I think, the awareness, moving awareness into action in the financial sector, combining a little bit the developer and trader enthusiasm for opportunities, but getting the LPUs and bilaterals ready and prepared, aligning those and making sure that we've dealt with the very clear legal and regulatory risks and gaps that still exist. So we'll need time and effort to get that right. And then really the first stage of making sure that everyone is adequately prepared to kind of qualify as a market participant based on what you're doing in your risk profile, being ready for balancing, understanding the tariff structure and changes, how will that impact investment and financial structuring, and the impact on bilaterals. So I think that if one breaks this down and looks at it in more of a sort of a roadmap, so to speak, one can start to see, well, we can compartmentalize, we can manage risk, and there are a lot of important reasons why we must not delay. So I think my message here, Rob, to I think everyone on the call is that we need to convert awareness into action. I think all role players need to start thinking of, are they capacitating and are they understanding? Where will they participate in the market? Where are the areas of risk? Do they just want to be in balancing on bilaterals? Are they actually going to trade? And then actively, we need to start on the private sector side, start to form more collaboration, more unity. And we do need to have a stronger push from business towards government to say, keep the market reforms on track, keep the market launch on target. I don't think, Keith has got a very difficult job. He's trying to manage the politics and the reform and the sort of issues within public sector around kind of capacitation and skills, etc., and the reform in itself of entities like NERSA. So it's important that actually business does start to kind of give a positive and unified voice that supports this program and understands what needs to be done and is actively preparing to support and participate and get ready. So I'm going to leave it there as this is an ongoing program of important focus area for the Energy Council. It is a dedicated work stream under NECOM. We have a structure and a business committee and a technical committee there. And we also now are actively starting to try and engage also with other kind of public sector entities, such as the ministry, on how we can support and participate. And behind that, what we are also trying to do is make sure that we can be as transparent and collaborative as possible around broader business understanding and participation. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you. Very slick, nice and quick. Thank you. There is a question here, but what do you call it? One is, I think, more for Keith. And there is a question here around, Jane, could you list some of the LPUs and what do you mean with, well, I know what you mean by bilaterals, but can you list some of the LPUs you think that are actively engaging? And then perhaps I can add my question to that question is around, last year we did, as Cresco and a few others, a lot of detailed workshops and training on SAWEM and waiting for the next version of the market code. But conscious there are three types of players out there in the load side. You have the large players, industrial players, you have sort of the mid-tier players who might be active, and then you have people who should be outsourcing their energy business to someone else because it's not their core business, maybe the hospitals and a few others. How would you say those three players perhaps should be approaching SAWEM or the introduction of SAWEM in terms of the level of engagement? Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. So I certainly wouldn't want to call out individual companies by name, and that was not the intention. So typically what I think is a area of concern and risk from let's call it the energy intensive users, who see the introduction of the market as changing a lot of the historical kind of structure and status quo of what they understand and their exposure to energy cost and risk. So without that confidence, insight in their own preparation, the default position is to push back and say, we want to see more transparency. We want to see the market launch. We want to see the data. Typically, everyone says we'd like to really get on top of the tariff restructuring. We see that as a big risk. Also, the vesting contracts. What is the cost and essentially what is the market SMP likely to be? The changing tariff structure is going to change the wholesale price. What will that mean for wheeling and those sort of aspects? So there is a lot of work that needs to be done in that regard. And I think that the incumbents in the system are the ones who naturally feel the pressure of that risk, whereas traders and generators see it obviously more as an opportunity. So that's where I think where the reference comes from. And that's why we do need to be more engaged as business, creating a little bit more awareness, collaboration. We need more of these type of events, but we need to be able to also deal with the granularity and the detail of these risks and issues because they are valid and they do need more work to be done. But what we can't do is expect that someone else is going to do that work for us. So I think from a private sector and business perspective, we need to kind of have more focused programs around unpacking these issues and creating collaboration. Hopefully that's in the time frames, but we can come back to the other issues. Rob.
And maybe last question then before you have to hear me speak and wax lyrical is there seems to be a lot of stuff happening. I'm sure Keith spends half of his day, and maybe he can respond to this question when it's his turn, engaging with different stakeholders, right? So NECOM as a process, Energy Council as a process. We've just responded to a few tenders around look at the market code on behalf of NGOs and groups. Like, how do we pull it all into one story so that we're not telling different stories or different views? And I know it's quite difficult, but how do we get this alignment?
Rob, on the public sector side, this was the benefit of the crisis, which launched the Energy Action Plan under the presidency and really accelerated the reforms through NECOM. So we know NECOM is a very specific vehicle and it's there more for technical delivery of reforms on the public sector side. And so we coordinate a lot of business support and participation there. NECOM is not going to address private sector readiness. So we do need to think a little bit more about how we're going to create structures and collaboration on the private sector side. I don't have an answer exactly for that. It's kind of ongoing, but we are trying to use these types of platforms. So we've had, increasingly more webinars and exposure around SAWEM. We've got more coming up, during NLIT, during kind of AEF, etc., to try and, at least in the beginning, start creating this push around awareness. Then I think the next step from awareness is then crafting the scope of action and getting participation. But ultimately, industry and players on their own accord need to start coordinating their own capacity and their own thinking around risk and preparation, because everyone in their own right will have to decide, are they going to be a market participant? Are they ready to enter the market, balancing what's the risk and impact? Are there bilaterals or their sort of energy exposure? Is that ready? But that I think is still work in progress.
Cool. Thank you, James. Thank you for that. Thank you for your time. So my slides now. So I think I'm trying to take a little bit of a view of what buyers are doing and how the market has changed over time. So most of the work I guess Cresco has done traditionally has really been focused on the bilateral market. So one buyer, one load, or one buyer and quite a few loads. If you look at some of the bigger deals, right, one load, a number of generators. If you look at some of the big deals that have been done, and for 95% of the work we're doing, the current wheeling framework works really well. Eskom to Eskom connected loads and that. We now have virtual wheeling coming, and I know Chris Yelland has a workshop, I think, on the 5th of June on virtual wheeling. Lots of excitement. Shirley Sovaldi from Cresco is presenting on that, and I think she's the right person for that. And for us, this is a really interesting opportunity to sort of access low voltage Eskom connected loads as well as loads in municipalities that perhaps have been slightly stranded. I know many municipalities are successful, but maybe not as many as we want. And I know a lot of our clients are largely municipal loads and unfortunately municipalities that are not in good financial standing. So therefore their ability to wheel or do other things is a bit limited. So for me, this is a very exciting opportunity to get more RE penetration into clients that traditionally haven't been able to do that. And then we have the market coming in, and we'll obviously the purpose of today's. But this has really moved very quickly, and these are just two facets of what is happening out there. Next slide, please. So outside of sort of the market, the wheeling framework rules, and Cresco will be releasing an article based on Cresco's views of the wheeling rules and the curtailment, probably early next week. For the clients, you'll be getting a 10-page version. For others, you'll be getting a LinkedIn post if it's of interest. But these are other bits of work that Cresco is seeing as quite valuable that talks to the offering out there. And the first one is, what is Eskom's long-term projections? And that's very much around the NYPD forecasting, a regulatory methodology that we learn about at university, we throw away, and then you learn about NERSA and you realize it's being used. And we've come up with the various scenarios going forward around a high road, which is actually the lowest increase, the low road being the highest increase, and what we think is a base case view. And that work does bring out very much the push by Eskom to convert more to fixed, to variable charges within the overall structure. And if you look at where the cost sits in that, the analysis does show that many of the Eskom RTP comments or proposals, as well as I think some of the things that's been said around SAWEM, around the fixed charges, are actually justified into the cost base. We might argue if they've been efficiently spent or not, but that's not the purpose of today's discussion. The next bit is around the Eskom retail tariff plan. Both what Eskom asked for, I guess, in 2022, what they asked for last year, what NERSA approved, what we believe Eskom will come and ask for again quite shortly, and then how the market will continue, or at least the tariff curve will continue to change over time. And this actually gets very complicated because you've got the unbundling of the tariffs, you've got the change in the WEPS rates, you've got the time of use changes, both what is approved this year by NERSA as well as into the future. Off-peak times in the middle of the day is one of the Cresco views. And unfortunately, this has had a significant impact on the financial viability or value of renewables in the sector as a way for clients to reduce their cost of energy, both buying from Eskom as well as from IPPs, both on-site and wheeling, although the implication for wheeling from a financial point of view is much higher. But on the other side, because of the restructuring of the tariff, it has also started supporting the best business case, which I believe is quite important, both in terms of the future energy mix, as well as supporting the grid, as well as mitigating arranged balancing concepts. So for us, sort of, there is some bad news in what's happened from a financial point of view, but it is very much starting to support the best business case. And then the second one is a lot of the financial analysis to date, we've really only put a notional value to carbon. The value of the REC between 3 cents and 12 cents. The value of carbon tax is still very much filtered down, and we're conscious that the carbon tax, the header and the detail are quite different in terms of what is set out. So we are starting to include the value of carbon in our thinking, both in terms of future carbon tax approaches and pricing, as well as perhaps how we take away the environmental attributes of the renewables and value that separately from the energy itself. And we are seeing some IPPs/aggregators offering energy separately themselves. And I think that's a really important distinction. That is a question for us around SAWEM, which is a technology agnostic market, and sort of what the JSE is doing or ZAREX, and how do they combine? And I think that is one of the big questions that I think is outside of Keith's control. But Keith, maybe you could make a comment about carbon during your presentation. But for us, it's quite an exciting space, and I guess a lot of people are asking us about international benchmarks, and perhaps how carbon is developed in other markets is something we could definitely learn from, because I think we are understating the value of carbon. And then how do these players, both large energy users, large megaflex loads that are maybe not on special deals, all the way down to municipals, how do they interact with SAWEM? And I know James touched on that at a high level. But for most of our clients who are many of the energy intensive user group, they looking to be a market participant, really less to be a trader of energy to make upside, but more as a risk mitigation against balancing and redeclaration. Perhaps also as their loads become more erratic due to commodity prices, they have the ability to sell this energy in the market as an alternative, all the way down to entities who are looking for a partner who would take on a lot of those responsibilities on their behalf, because they focused on their core business. And that's maybe more the sort of commercial property, smaller manufacturing entities and that. So I think in answer to the question I think we're seeing different clients take on different approaches depending on their requirements, their human capacity, and also their financial capacity to engage in this, because there's a lot happening in this market and it's quite complicated. Next slide, please. So outside of this, and I think this talks to Vincenzia's slides coming in later, is our whole approach to funding is going to change, because we can change the market, we can change the tariffs, everyone's ready, but if we're not building more generation to replace the generation that is going to slowly come offline from Eskom, either through the decommissioning program or because the older power stations are falling over, or whatever the reason is, system constraints. And I think the bilateral market is very well understood. And if you had 10 lawyers in the same room, we might standard PPA as they have in Europe. But as we work towards the aggregator market, which is we're getting some commonality on the PPAs we've seen, but we're still seeing some outliers. Also conscious that we don't have many aggregators actually at financial close. There are a few that have successfully done that, but a lot of it is still talk or term sheets. And once those are turned into financial close, we can say that these PPAs that were presented were bankable, or more importantly, fundable. And then how do we get these projects through the trader market on short-term PPAs and bankable? In SAP, we have seen a few IPPs spend equity on merchant plants, not large volumes, but that has had a market for 15 years. So you can do regression analysis around SAP trading prices and take some views, whereas in South Africa, we don't have that statistical database. So it is quite difficult to do. I know Cresco is currently involved in some work on this, and we unfortunately don't have all the answers. We have more risks than answers, but I think for us, this is a key part of the market that is outside of Eskom's control, but definitely within the private sector viewpoints. And to say, yeah, we'll come up with an insurance product when the time is right, I think that's a bit overly simplistic, because these things don't design themselves, and you need to prepare for this. And so this for us is one of the real concerns around the opening of the market, is that we have the tools, we have the software, we have the balancing, vesting contracts is transparent, but do we have funders who are willing to take on this future market risk based on the structure that is there? And at the moment, Cresco's view is probably not. We have a few, but probably not enough to continue to build the 4,000 to 5,000 megawatts of PV and wind and larger increasing scale of BESS that is required really to support the grid going forward. So a key risk that unfortunately is outside of the market operator's control, but I think something that is not being fully covered, and I know is definitely on the Energy Council spotlight and others. Last slide, please. So as James showed a phased approach, and Keith will show a phased approach, Cresco also has a phased approach in terms of that. And I think that's very much talking to what we are engaging with our clients about. We have the target for next year. What will next year exactly look like? What will the implication be? But maybe the message coming out in the interest of time is waiting for the market to open and then go, oh, this is interesting. Oh, I didn't realize this is coming. That's not the right approach. You need to start preparing for this. And some of the work we're doing, for example, is what could potential day-ahead pricing be? We have some analysis, not perfect. I know there are other consultants out with some analysis, some better than others, some probably better than Cresco's. I don't think anyone has the right answer. Some maybe have slightly better answers based on the analysis that's there. And I think the risk of balancing, how accurate is your generation, how accurate is your forecasting on your load. We are seeing that when we start running projected forecast on loads versus actual loads after 2 or 3 years, that there's no such thing as a 24/7 base load. There is changes, which does affect the business case. So for us, the focus really for many clients now is look at what's been procured, figure out how well it's doing, see if our assumptions in our business case are still valid, update them if needed, and start proactively looking at the market and where either we can outsource some of the obligations or services, ones that we want to do ourselves, or at least partner with the right type of entity that can offer that solution. And we're currently involved in a few RFPs where we're doing some on-site generation projects as well as wheeling. And for us, the perfect partner, call it aggregator, IPP trader, whatever name, is someone who can provide both services and provide sort of a bit of a one-stop energy sort of solution to a client that when the market comes, they're comfortable that this partner can take on the market and accurately engage and proactively engage as it develops. So thank you very much. I see there are no questions for me. So then perhaps straight on to the person that everyone actually wanted to hear, which is Keith. Good luck. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Rob, and good afternoon, everyone. So from my perspective, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail of where we are in terms of the SAWEM implementation and the process over the next year, now almost just short of 11 months to the rollout of the market. So yeah, if we can go to the next slide. The context that I've tried to put it in is sort of what we call the building blocks, the idea of the key components that we need in terms of the market and how that would then kind of come together to our minimum requirement of what needs to be in place for April 2026. So the idea here, obviously, is the first is the market code, and many of you will have seen the work that has been done in terms of the draft code that was released last year, the workshops that we held, and then a lot of the inputs that have been received. We have been going through the process over the last 4 or 5 months with those people who provided comments. So we had 25 organizations and individuals that gave us quite detailed comments in terms of the market code. And we've gone through what we call page turner events with some 20 of those organizations to kind of look at how can we improve the code, what are the things that we need to do, and we've done most of that work. So the revised draft is ready. The one outstanding item is a legal due diligence. So we have had, with support from NECOM, a group of lawyers, both internal to the NTCSA and external, going through the code and looking at some of the elements that maybe need to change just to fit into the way the ERA actually works in terms of NERSA's powers, what the market operator needs to do. So the idea then is that once we have that due diligence, and we are expecting it back in the next couple of weeks, we will finalize that draft, the revised draft, take it through NTCSA governance again. We did get approval for the draft that we've have finalized now, but once we've done the due diligence, we will do another round of governance and then release that to everybody to essentially internalize. We will have another launch as we did last year. We had the original launch. We'll do a relaunch to include the revised code, and then we will finally submit that to NERSA. So the timeline for that, we're hoping that we will have that relaunch during June and submit to NERSA by the end of June for them to start processing the market code. If we can go to the second slide, then in terms of the other work that we've been dealing with, so one of the important aspects was the market operator license. As per the ERA, we are expected to apply for a license with NERSA, and we had a lot of input to suggest that maybe that license needs to be approved by NERSA prior to submitting the code to NERSA. It's kind of a sequential series of events. So we have had the NTCSA approval for our license application, and that was still some couple of months ago. But we've had some issues, obviously, around the independence and governance for the NTCSA in terms of delegation of authority to finally submit that to NERSA. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we will have crossed that threshold and be able to submit to NERSA for their approval. Interestingly, NERSA is ready for this. They have been very actively looking at what the ERA requires and the things that they have to do, and are anticipating this submission. So hopefully we'll be able to move relatively quickly once that is with them. But at this stage, the delay is really on our side as the NTCSA, but we will hopefully get that through relatively soon. Then a lot of the core work really starts once the code and the license are with NERSA. We then have to start working on a couple of other really important building blocks. So one is the vesting contracts, and it was raised by both James and Robert about what the vesting contracts are about, and these are crucial to the functioning of the future market because it guides the transition, and that transition really is all about how Eskom generation and distribution participate in the market. What are the things, sort of the guide rails that we put in place to ensure that market dominance doesn't become something that trips up the market from day one. So we are working under the NECOM process on an industry paper on the vesting contracts. The intention then is to release that for public comment, have a couple of workshops on that, and then put through proposed contracts based on that paper, and take them through governance and then NERSA for final approval. Our timeline for that is also in the next 6 months to have that finalized, because that would be crucial to the functioning of the market from the 1st of April. Thanks. If we can go to the next slide. The other key building block for us is then the wholesale tariff. And under NECOM, we have established a task team to start looking at that, because the wholesale tariff really becomes quite fundamental to how we transition from the regulated tariff mechanism, and particularly the MYPD process, into a future market-based price, but also dealing with what wholesale tariffs would look like. Specifically, we're trying to deal with things like legacy charges, capacity charges. How does all of that fit into a competitive market? So our plan is to have a draft set of rules for NERSA to consider, and then once those rules are approved, to actually come up with our first wholesale tariff, which would apply from the 1st of April. And that wholesale tariff then forms the basis for the vesting contracts downstream, at least with the distributors, that they're able to then hedge back to a wholesale tariff, which is a regulated tariff going into the future. The one other piece of work that we have been doing quite a lot of work on is the market school. So the idea of the market school is that we want to start looking at how can we prepare market participants, industry, the regulators, the policy makers for the market, and that would mean that we have special training events. So we've started planning those events from July through to March next year, looking at developing the course material with support from GIZ and Nordpool and others, looking at how we can get that material up to a standard that we require for the training, but then also looking at the potential for a simulation tool, which would then help in that training, that we have an opportunity for people to test out how the markets work and the different kind of rules around the market and what that would mean. So those 2 to 3 days really the participants come out of that with a good sense of how the market works into the future. So we've done a fair amount of work on that, but there's still some attention to detail on that, trying to sort out the simulation tool. Our intention is to have a dry run in June, so it's the end of next month for the training, and then roll that out from July, and so set up a platform for people to be able to participate in that and to book for those events going into the future.
Keith, I have a question now for you quickly while we're on the market school. You talked about a driver's license to be a member of the market. Can you just touch on that a little bit when you talk about the market school? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So the idea is that if we're going to have market participants participating on the platforms, that they need to have gone through the school. They need to attended at least one of the courses in order for them to then be certified from our perspective to participate. So that means that any market participant should have at least one trader who is certified to enter bids into the system. And so, that becomes a kind of a prerequisite for market participation, that we have at least some traders who have gone through the course as part of the market school. So yes, it's quite an important building block for us as well. Thanks. If we go into the next slide. Then it's kind of almost goes without saying, but it is a crucial component for us, is the system development. As we have mentioned in the past at the workshops, we do have existing systems within the NTCSA which have been operating for some time now in preparation. So we have the day ahead bids and offers, we have the scheduling processes, we have the settlement, but now what we need to do is spend quite a lot of time on the additional components that are required, specifically intraday. Managing the balancing. We do have balancing, but there are still some developments around that to improve. But then also developing what we call the portal, the SAWEM portal. We do have a version in place, but it's about getting it ready for the market platforms to take bids and offers from entities outside the Eskom firewall, be able to process those and do the scheduling and then the settlements. We also then need to look at how we interface with the banking space fraternity, because obviously the market operator needs to function based on the cash in the bank and making sure that we have access to that information and are doing that safely. So looking at issues around cybersecurity, etc., is quite a key component of that as well. We are recruiting for that, but our next steps will be to continue the gap analysis that we're ready in time for April for at least the system platforms that would be in place. Then the last of the building blocks is really the participation agreements. So we have the balancing agreements and the market participation agreements. As James did highlight, I mean, there's always the possibility that on day one, we're focusing only on Eskom buying and selling through the platform with at least some transparency around the process. But the idea is we want to have those agreements in place to facilitate that there could be third parties also coming into the market, that we open it up for full competition. And that is the idea then, that those agreements would be there so that we can start signing up participants as and when the regulator allows for those participants in the market. And then just lastly, in terms of the slide, in terms of kind of where we're going, on the next slide, please. It's just really our kind of roadmap looking into the future. The idea is that we have these 7 key components that we treat as sort of prerequisites. But in addition, we would also then be looking at the potential for new capacity markets, looking at bilateral hedging, trying to create platforms for that as a key component of the future market. They're definitely important for the market, but if they're not there on the 1st of April, it wouldn't delay us. But the other 7 are critical building blocks for us to be able to operate on the 1st of April and to make sure that they are there for us to be effective on that date. And I think that's really the last slide I want to talk to. Obviously, the there is an additional slide just to kind of highlight where we are relative to the independence of the TSO, which is also quite critical. But I think, that can be something that we also discuss while we're rolling out the market over the next year. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you, Keith. So there are a few questions for you, but I'm going to touch on some questions for you. So do you mind just moving back to the previous slide, Emily, just to that one? So I did present to NERSA a couple of weeks ago through a learning session, and I was pleasantly surprised at really the quality of the questions and their understanding of the market. So I would echo what you're saying, Keith. And they asked me, what's the big thing that's needed? And I said 5 or 6 or maybe even 15 Keith Bowens, or at that level of understanding. So, capacitating the market operator. So while you're doing webinars, who's doing work in the background? But I mean, how you realistically, what's happening there, and where are you in your process?
Yeah, so our big thing is to try and recruit. So I've got a core team of the 7 of us, all taking on different responsibilities. So it's about getting everyone up to kind of taking a lead on a lot of the work that needs to be done. So as you can see, there are 7 key elements that need to kind of be developed, and it is about gearing everyone up. Our intention is to try and recruit so that we're at least sort of heading towards 30 odd people by the time we launch the market. But the earlier we can recruit those people, the more we can then get them up and running and ready, because as you say, a lot of this is quite intricate. A lot of what we're dealing with, it takes time to learn, and the experience of operating the market. That's why having the internal market within Eskom, which we've been running now since 2019, and of course some of us, that's why we have grey hair, used to be involved in running this from 1996 through to 2005. We've got a lot of that experience, and it kind of gives you sort of a good foundation. But obviously it's very different when you open the market to real money and massive impact on participants. So I think the idea here is to train people up as much as possible internally, as from within the market operator, but also the market participants.
Cool, thank you. And another question quickly is, I touched on the value of carbon, and could you just talk about how the market is treating carbon or not? My understanding is not, to a certain extent, right? And how you perhaps see the linkages with other markets, because in my understanding is we kind of have to have a parallel system that doesn't quite trade at the same time, but does talk to each other, right?
Yeah, no, correct. So the multi-market model does not differentiate between different types of electrons. I mean, electrons are electrons, and we trade. Obviously, we have trade in energy and capacity, but we don't have trade at the moment in green attributes or any kind of separate attributes. And so the idea then is that we have existing facilities within South Africa that can take on those accountabilities, but it may well be that we need to spend more time in ensuring that there is a seamless approach to that those attributes are as tradable and as, let's say, fungible and kind of credible trading as it is on the energy markets. I think one of the important things is the time stamping that now needs to start happening around attributes, and making sure that those attributes are very specific to potentially individual hours, in the same way that we do with electrons, and that's quite a big step for all of us to actually have to figure out how that process would work in the future. Cool.
I know the ZA-REX registry does have time registration and accreditation and stuff. Cresco actually bought some REX and have done it for our client and that, so that would work well. There's a couple of questions here that I'm going to paraphrase into one for you. It's around market transparency and signals to the market, the sort of the portal. Can you talk a bit about some of that thinking, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, so the idea is, again, we want to try and be as transparent as possible. We have to be as transparent as possible. The main issue around provision of data is that, to a large extent, we provide prices, we provide sort of aggregated positions, but we avoid providing details of what everyone's bidding and offering and what their individual positions are, because that becomes a bit of an issue around potential collusion. Because these are repeated auctions, there's a lot of the theory behind why, from a market power issue and a competition issue, you don't have reveal all the bids and offers. But the important thing is that the prices need to be there so that everyone can see what the consequences are decisions. So we would have day ahead prices, intraday prices, balancing prices. All of that needs to be in place, as well as information around the aggregated position, because I think that's also useful information for everyone to see how exposed is the market to risk in terms of, is there enough supply on a daily basis. That sort of information should also be made available. But yeah, we're not going to, well, I don't see us releasing participant specific information for general consumption.
Cool, thank you. Last question before Vincenzia takes us home. So we've got all this excitement about virtual wheeling. How will a municipal customer change its approach when the market comes? Because they are kind of contracting through a regulated distributor, right? Which would be one of the munis, or that muni would outsource its obligation to Eskom distribution if it is not capacitated. So, and I don't think, at least the work we've done, we've never really looked at that. We've always looked at Eskom connected loads participating in the market. Thank you.
So theoretically, the important thing is the qualifying criteria that are set for customers. At the moment, we've proposed that we use the same as the sort of wheeling framework, which is predominantly medium and high voltage, although I understand now with the new rules it's a little bit different. But the idea is that if a customer is medium or high voltage within a municipality, they have the same rights to participate in the market as anyone that's connected to the Eskom grid, and that means then that you separate out that customer's meter point. So when we define the municipal boundary, those points within the municipality's network actually now no longer the responsibility of the municipality from an energy perspective. Obviously, network responsibility remains as given as current, but energy responsibility now shifts. And so when customers start making choices, they become balance responsible for themselves if they are a market participant. Otherwise, they go through a trader who becomes balance responsible on their behalf. And so that means that you do differentiate between what happens in terms of the wires and what happens in terms of energy, and that customers inside municipalities have the same power to make those decisions. Obviously, that means that there has to be tariff reform at a municipal level, as well as what Eskom is going through in terms of distribution tariffs. And that's quite an important thing for them to understand.
Thank you, Keith. We'll take you out of the firing line because I know we could continue forever. And I'm going to hand over to Vincenzia. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Vincenzia Leitich. I'm an executive in the power sector team at Standard Bank. And maybe just on the next slide, I'm not going to go through it in detail. So the next slide. Thank you. So just on this slide, I guess the point here is really kind of the exposure which the banks in the market have to existing bilateral renewable energy project deals, and also, the amount of projects that we are looking at to close in the next, couple of months, and the impact that SAWEM is going to have on existing projects that have already closed with contracts in place, and how we obviously negotiate and look at risk mitigants on new projects that are going to be closing shortly. The other point here just to make, and we've touched on it earlier, is just around the role that some of the aggregators in the market can make when we look at funding these transactions and the risk mitigants. And we've recently closed 3 of the aggregator projects in the last couple of months. So just moving on to the next slide. It is the whole process and the whole sort of introduction of SAWEM obviously is a difficult concept for lenders to get around, because we are operating in a little bit of an unknown, which does make the structuring quite difficult. Obviously, there are going to be opportunities, risks, which will have to be mitigated, and some innovative funding ideas that we'll need to think about and put into place in some of the new projects. But really what I'm going to focus on is the impacts that we'll see for some of the bilateral power projects, as I mentioned, changes to existing projects, and then obviously what we need to think about in future projects that we're looking to close for mandatory changes that will need to be input into these projects, and then kind of other thinking which we're already looking at and considering to the extent there wants to be fully emergence into the SAWEM process. So the first one, and obviously this has been spoken about a lot, so I'm not going to go into the detail, but more on the implication and how this risk can be mitigated, is obviously the cost of the balancing responsibility, the responsible entity. And we are finding that this concept is now starting to be negotiated into PPAs, but there is going to be a cost, first of all, to the extent that there are any penalties that are levied. Who's going to bear that cost? Is it going to be the borrower, the generator, is the borrower, or the off-taker? And if there are those costs, where's the funding for those going to come from? Also, because of the strict forecasting, there are going to have to be certain tools that are put in place to make sure that the generator can forecast properly. And this might entail, new people, new personnel to run those tools, etc. So definitely an increase in cost there, including any administrative costs that might be needed. So really, obviously, these are big topics to go into, but ways that we would look to manage that risk is putting in some form of contingency. Difficult because how long is a piece of string? We don't know what those penalties could be, but that could be a solution, building in some sort of contingency, stressing the models to an extent to make sure they can cater for penalties, potentially not palatable, I'm sure, but looking for some sort of equity support to back off those penalties if required. But all of this obviously does lead to an increase in tariff because those costs have to be put somewhere, which is an impact. And I guess other considerations then as well is, do we put in battery? How do we manage that? And if we do, then that also comes at an additional cost. And these are the things we're definitely looking at. We're having discussions with a lot of our projects that we mandated on, but all of it does ultimately lead to an increase in cost and a little bit of unknown in terms of, what could the penalties be. Maybe just moving on to the next slide, and I am conscious of time because we don't have much time left. So I'm going to go through the next couple of slides, or this slide quite quickly, and focus on the aggregator slide a little bit more. But really, this is here other changes that we can see happening, which would be a big impact for our risks and risk mitigants, is the shift from a fixed price to whatever the market price is going to be. And how is this going to be handled? I mean, as a lending institution, as funders, we're very used to fixed price, 20-year power purchase agreements, certain amounts of power that's delivered, etc. So we used to sort of a template of a power purchase agreement, and this might all need to be changed, and some thought around how we get our mindset around that and those changes. Some of the mitigants towards market price risks are contracts for difference, but who is going to provide that? Who's going to take the risk if a price is high or a price is lower? There's also space here for derivatives, and where can sort of global markets teams come in and provide some solutions here, which is also something that we are considering at the moment. Again, on the volumes and how that's addressed, there won't be in the power purchase agreements what we used to in terms of the obligations to deliver or receive, but there has to be responsibilities for bidding generation and for the consumption of that energy. So these changes here probably might not be as immediate as some of the others that we are putting into our power purchase agreements at the moment and having discussions around, but definitely something we're considering. I think the other point just to note is some of the standard sort of security and protection that we see in the market in terms of guarantees, availability and performance guarantees, and how those are impacted because of the addition of penalties on top of that, and how they're measured on an annual rather than on a daily basis. Okay, next slide. So this really is just the aggregator model, which I'm sure everybody on the call is familiar with, but just useful to have that picture in mind whilst we move on to the next slide, which goes on to how we see an aggregator being able to absorb and provide a buffer to some of the risks that we've spoken about, which is really some of the thinking that we've had internally. And, you know, they're all sort of the risks that I've mentioned earlier, but now they can be moved from the generator onto the aggregator, and the generator can sort of focus on, you know, what its job is in producing energy. So the first one is obviously the transfer of the balancing responsibility and imbalanced risk. And because the aggregator model is really focused on having a pool of generation and a portfolio of off-takers, they're obviously best placed or well placed to manage this risk in terms of if there's over or unders of generation from their generation portfolio, taking that away from the generation or the generator. The same thing on the reduced forecasting burden and cost. You know, the aggregators put in a lot of systems, etc., because they're an aggregator and this is their business to manage exactly that in terms of how they're going to manage their portfolio on both sides. And so potentially there's less sort of investment in those sort of tools from a generator level. And then obviously also on the simplified market operation. So the aggregator can really, you know, take the role of managing SAWEM, all the different market-facing complexities, and also on top of that then benefit from any additional markets that are in place, which a generator might not be able to do. So definitely some risks that an aggregator can absorb just by virtue of the fact that they're an aggregator, but also definitely some returns for them as well. And I guess the last point, and I am rushing, apologies, is the fact that obviously all of this has to be properly documented into contracts. And so really the thinking now has to be on what needs to be included, what are the changes, how do these contracts need to be negotiated. And yeah, so I guess I see you, Rob's come online, so I'm going to...
No, I have a question before we go. I'm sure we can have 1 or 2 minutes. So
sure.
All good. So I guess the question is, you as Standard Bank have backed the aggregator space. You've got some successes, you know, well done. We're very excited to get these projects from Excel into real things. Are aggregators ready for the market? Because like at the moment, they've been focused on signing short-term PPAs, getting financial close, starting construction, but are they ready for what's coming, in your view?
I think so. And Rob, we've obviously had discussions with some of the aggregators in terms of what this means and the risks. And absolutely, I think it is at foremost of their thinking and how they're managing their portfolios, including, you know, do they put in BESS, do they not? What systems do they need? What trading systems, etc. So I absolutely do think they are.
And then last question, there aren't any in the chat there, but if there are any more, please put them in and we'll try and respond to them. But contract for differences, you know, an alternative to wheeling PPAs, virtual PPAs kind of thing, right? How far is your thinking as Standard Bank around when that will happen and transition? Because a lot of the questions we've been asked is, how do these PPAs have to be restructured under SAWEM, or do we just replace them with the contract for difference like we see in other markets?
So I think, sort of as mentioned earlier, there will be building blocks, and the first step will be on kind of the points I raised in my initial slide in terms of balanced responsible party, etc. And then that will be sort of the second kind of changes in our PPAs. And I think also once there's more comfort that, you know, it's working, the traders are also, there's track record, then I think that there will be more sort of uptake and more focus. I mean, we are looking at it, but I think, you know, who's going to provide it and where's the risk going to sit when there's still so many unknowns? That would be my take on it.
Cool. Well, thank you. Caught up quickly. Thank you, Tori, to give you the afternoon shift. But thanks everyone for joining the webinar. As said, you will receive a recording and the slides, and we'll try and answer as many of the questions as we can in the follow-up feedback. But hopefully you can join us at the next one. Thank you for your time. Thank you. Cheers.